Hello everyone. In light of NASA's ignition update on their space plans, let's talk about SLS, NASA's Space Launch System. Now, this is not the normal intended configuration of SLS. Its normal intended configuration was supposed to have a full 8.4 meter upper stage matching the core, and that stage was called EUS, or Exploration Upper Stage. Now, that would have been the standard configuration for SLS. There was no other stage. Once EUS was introduced, that would be taking EUS's place. Because the ICPS, the interim cryogenic upper stage that they are currently using, there is a limited quantity of. So basically, they just have one left. And right now, the idea is that for Artemis 3, they probably won't be using an upper stage because it's just a low Earth orbit launch. And so they'll keep the mission to low Earth orbit and not have an upper stage. The upper stage is only meant for going to the moon. And then the one ICPS that they have would be used for Artemis 4. And then this version with Vulcan's Centaur 5 would be for Artemis 5. But they say a very curious thing when it comes to SLS and their plans. They keep using the word standardized, as if SLS wasn't standardized before. I mean, SLS is standardized. It's standardized to the EUS, but they're using this word as if the design of SLS was somehow in flux beforehand, and now with Centaur 5, it will be solidified. It was already solidified. Let's just be clear. I mean, I like the Centaur 5 configuration. It's good and all. It's cheaper, but it was already standardized, and EUS was the proper upper stage, and this whole standardized business is just total nonsense. So, and we don't know how much it's going to really cost to adapt Centaur 5 to this, but probably not too much. I don't know where along the way we are on EUS. That has conflicting reports, let's put it charitably. But all right, we have this configuration. Let's say this is the standardized configuration. Great. The problem is that they seem ambivalent about whether they're going to use this beyond Artemis 5 anyway. And so how standardized is this configuration when it might be used only once if some people get their way? This rocket right here, SLS, can send 37 tons to the moon on a single launch. And Starship Super Heavy right now cannot, if they're going to go with their plans for recovery and everything. So how much is it going to cost to get a payload of equivalent size, 37 tons, using Starship Super Heavy over to the moon compared to SLS? Now, SLS is really expensive by all accounts, and I would expect that those prices would go down. Now, here's a complicating factor. People always like to throw in the development cost. On the one hand, they're going to say cancel the program, forget about the development cost, sunk cost fallacy. The sunk cost fallacy is that you shouldn't be taking into account all the money that you have spent already in trying to determine whether to continue a program. And so that's fine, but then they will bring up the development cost as a reason to cancel it because it's costed too much. Well, I mean, it's already developed, so it's a sunk cost. And meanwhile, Starship Super Heavy is still in the development phase, and we don't know how much that's costing because that's not transparent to us. It could end up costing more than SLS's development. Not that that matters a whole lot because, it is a more complicated system, and we have to give it to them. They've got the tiles, they're trying to do re-entry, chopsticks, the whole 9 yards. So it's all right that costs more potentially, but let's not talk about the development costs when it comes to SLS. That's all sunk cost fallacy. We have to take a look at the unit costs going forward. The unit costs seem to be quite high, but there aren't any good numbers for it. I would personally estimate it's actually going to end up being $1 billion for this configuration with the Centaur 5 per launch. I still think that that's horrible. And the boosters should be cheaper because they were cheaper back in the shuttle days. And I wish we could reuse the engines down here, the RS-25s, though SpaceX seems to have no problem dunking a whole bunch of engines in the water, more than probably we will ever build of the RS-25. So it's weird to think about exactly why these are so much more expensive than the Raptor engines, so that SpaceX can dump 33 Raptor engines on a core stage of Super Heavy without even thinking about it. But okay, so this is expensive. How expensive would a launch of Starship Super Heavy be? And exactly how many launches would it take to get our payload to the moon? 37 tons. Let's just say 37 tons, okay? This configuration might carry a little bit less than that. That's generally the number for EUS, though EUS could maybe carry a little bit more than that, depending on how you do things. Well, let's take a look at the situation. So what I'd like to talk about is the Falcon Starship improvement factor, because we need some sort of metric to estimate how much Starship Super Heavy is going to cost per launch, and the closest thing is Falcon 9. Now, Falcon 9 is very different. It is 10 times less the size of the full stack Starship Super Heavy. Falcon 9 is about 550 tons on launch, and Starship Super Heavy is 5,500 tons or more, depending on future upgrades. So we've got a factor of 10, which in theory would mean that if Starship Super Heavy was run exactly the same as Falcon 9, expending the upper stage, we would expect something like 10 times the payload capacity, right? So there is a lot more complexity, though, with the tiles, the reentry of the upper stage, the chopsticks, lots more engines, etc. So there's that to consider, but we'll set that aside for now. But there is also the recovery of the upper stage. So the naive estimate of its launch cost to a customer, I note that I say a customer, not internally. We can't verify their internal numbers. The only number that matters is what they offer somebody else. That's what market economics is. Like, if I grow a strawberry, it doesn't matter that the cost to me, I could pretend that the cost to me was just the water that went in feeding the strawberry, right? That I could say, but it doesn't account for the soil or the original plant or anything like that. But I could say that it's just pennies to grow the strawberry. But if I'm not willing to sell you a pound of strawberries for less than $5, the price of the strawberries is $5 per pound. So that's what we're going for here. That's the price that they offer somebody else. We're not talking about their internal cost. The naive estimate of its launch cost to a customer, given first stage recoverability, but we don't know about the second stage because Falcon 9 doesn't have second stage recovery, would be 10 times Falcon 9, or about $700 million, since it should in theory be able to carry 10 times the payload in that configuration. A little bit more potentially because it's methane and oxygen instead of kerosene and oxygen. But we'll say that the cost is $700 million. We're not going by the per kilogram amounts because we don't know what the payload capacity really is. Okay, so then the Falcon Starship improvement factor then is how much less than that the cost of Starship really is. So if we get to launch Starship Super Heavy and do the whole thing, get whatever payload it can carry to orbit, so one launch, whatever the payload capacity is, if we could get that down by a factor of 2 compared to the 700 million, that would be 350 million per launch. So what would be a reasonable improvement factor? Well, let's just say exponential improvement, right? So this is the next rocket from SpaceX. They haven't done anything between Falcon 9 and Starship. Okay, there's Falcon Heavy, but that's sort of like, we'll just call it Falcon 9 as well, okay? So we could say exponential improvement, which would be great. No existing rocket company has managed that since maybe the 1950s, right? So exponential improvement in costs means that a launch of Starship Super Heavy would decrease by a factor of 2.7, and that's straight up with if the payload tracks with Falcon 9 exactly, so 10 times the payload of Falcon 9, that would mean that the cost per kilogram would go down by 2.7. So that would lead to a cost per launch of 258 million. And that's what I will go by, because they're trying to. A lot of SpaceX fans are trying to claim that this thing can launch just basically on the cost of its fuel, which is not how anything works. There's a lot of other stuff that goes into preparing a launch than just how much the cost of the fuel is. And the cost of 5,000 tons of fuel is going to be quite a lot. Liquid oxygen, even though we have got oxygen in the atmosphere, takes a lot of power to liquefy it. So you can't drive the cost down to some of the claims that people have made online. 258 tons would be great. I mean, that would actually be less than the cost of Delta IV Heavy, just to give you an idea. If you could get 200 tons to orbit with that, again, expending the upper stage as Falcon 9 would, then you're talking about $1,000 per kilogram, which was the original sort of aim for Falcon 9, but they didn't quite get there. I think it's something on the order of 4,000, 5,000 per kilogram right now. It depends on whether it's a ride-sharing one or not. I think ride-sharing goes up to 7,000 per kilogram or something like that. So it's a vast improvement over Falcon 9, a reasonable improvement, and still a great cost for such a large rocket, and obviously much cheaper than SLS. No matter what happens with SLS, SLS will never match this, even though SLS is half the size of Starship Super Heavy. The problem is that Starship Super Heavy does have the recoverability thing, one, which adds dry mass, and two, is using methane and oxygen, which is not as good at getting stuff to the moon as hydrogen and oxygen. So even though SLS is physically smaller, it has a lot of energy in the core and the upper stage, whether the upper stage is EUS or Centaur 5. So even though it costs more, a single launch can do more as far as getting stuff to the moon, unless Starship fits an upper stage, which they have no plans for. They have not said anything about Starship carrying an upper stage, but that would change the equation quite a lot. So we are assuming multiple launches of Starship, and if we have $1 billion for the cost of an SLS launch eventually, if we could get it down to that, then if we have to launch Starship 4 or 5 times, and it's probably gonna take more than that, 4 or 5 times to get 37 tons over to the moon, then Starship Super Heavy actually costs more. I've seen estimate up to $2 billion, but I don't think it should be costing $2 billion per launch. I think a lot of stuff is getting dumped into that, which is like fixed costs, and then sometimes they try to throw in development costs into it too. But let's hope it's not that much. but then that would change the equation, and that would mean roughly 8 launches of Starship Super Heavy. And you could argue, oh well, no, Starship Super Heavy would cost less than that, but I don't believe it. I just don't. So I believe you could get it down to 258 million. So people have assumed that Starship Super Heavy is obviously going to be better than the Space Launch System SLS in terms of conducting a moon mission. It's got to be way cheaper. But if you need a whole lot of launches to get a lander over to the moon, and your lander is like the entirety of Starship, so Lunar Starship or something like that, that's even worse, then that rather tilts the balance compared to SLS. Because SLS, if it had a properly designed lander, which currently nobody seems to want to do, if it had a 37-ton lander, which would be fine for landing on the moon, the Apollo lunar lander was only 16 tons. 37 is lots. So you could send Orion in one launch, you could send a lander in a second launch, 2 launches, you have a moon mission. As opposed to Starship Super Heavy, which would still take the Orion, because Orion is the only spacecraft that can come back directly from the moon. So you still need the SLS launch for that. And then you've got however many refueling missions you need for Lunar Starship, 10, 20, whatever. And you can see that eventually there comes a point, regardless of what your estimate of this is, where the Starship Super Heavy version is actually going to cost more than the SLS. And so, my point is, I want SLS to stick around. I want SLS to stick around long enough so that SpaceX can't pretend that Starship Super Heavy is cheap. So not the first bill that they sent to NASA. They could undersell it to NASA on the first one. I want to see a full-on thing before we retire SLS. Okay, I mean, we've done the development costs in SLS. It's fine. It's just sitting there. We don't have to necessarily pay for more of them, but it should still be ready because eventually we're going to find out exactly how much the full-on lunar mission is going to cost with Starship Super Heavy, and I want SLS to be breathing down their necks. I want to see what the numbers really are, because I don't believe either the schedules or the price estimates coming out of Elon Musk. Now there's a whole other subject, that's New Glenn, and I wouldn't mind giving New Glenn a little bit more time too. But, we will see about that too. At least New Glenn is operational. So we will see whether New Glenn can match up. And New Glenn could probably be a better competitor to SLS, but it needs to actually carry its maximum payload to orbit. And we need to see how much that is, and we need to see how much it can actually carry to the moon. But at least they seem to be trying to make it capable, and it's got somewhat less complexity because it's got the non-reusable upper stage, and it's gonna fling those to the moon. So SLS, don't cheer its demise too soon. I hope that this standardized version, as they call it, really is standardized, and maybe Jarek Isaacman can find a way to get the costs down and twist some arms on that, and then we can see a version that's going to be actually competitive. So with those thoughts, I'll say thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please do press like. If you have any comments or suggestions, please leave them in the comment section below, and I'll see you next time.